Hey everybody, welcome back to my Which Modeler is Best video. Now, what an interesting question, and at the same time, what a silly question, because I'm probably one of the first people to say that I don't really feel there is any best. I've said this a bunch of times. We live in a great time to be a guitar player. We've got so many options to capture amazing tones, whether we're talking about recording in the studio or getting great tones when playing live or just sitting in our room. The problem is it becomes a very complex question simply because we have a whole bunch of people with different needs, different opinions on what actually sounds quote unquote good, different tastes. We have things such as confirmation bias and things such as just really poor comparative testing that really causes a lot of issues. And I wanted to do this video to discuss some of the things that I have come across in a lot of the discussions I've had online, on my YouTube channel, on Facebook, and you name it, about different modelers and my thoughts and opinions on them. Now keep in mind what I'm saying in this video, a large portion of it is just based off of my opinion, and I'm totally understanding of anybody who disagrees with it. I don't think I'm necessarily right about everything. That is an opinion-based thing. But there are some facts that we also have to deal with. Now, let's dive right into this. And I'm going to have some audio examples to illustrate my point a little bit later, but I just wanted to have this discussion first. I've done a series recently on my YouTube channel called Just How Good Is the Line 6 Helix, where what I've done is I've taken different, very well-respected modelers, whether software-based or hardware-based, and compared it to the Line 6 Helix. Now, this is a very difficult thing to do, because sometimes comparisons are either extremely difficult or next to impossible to do in a way where it's really meaningful. Why do I say that? Well, one of the things I see, and doing this series has kind of created a lot of discussion in the internet forums that I've been in and even on my YouTube channel, and a lot of great discussion, but also a lot of typical internet stuff of this one's horrible, this one's the best, nothing beats, Modeler A, Modeler B sucks, and all these really intelligent ways of expressing yourself without really wanting to dive into further discussion. Now, what I find is that most of the folks that have these very strong opinions and just throw out either, profanities or insults about it when they're having discussions really have never done any proper comparisons. And I think that it's super, super important that if we're going to have very strong opinions about this is better, or that's better, or this sucks, or that sucks, we should have at least done the comparisons properly to actually have what could be considered a valid opinion on the matter. And let me give you an example. I recently did a video where I compared the Friedman B100 model from the Fractal FM3 to the Friedman B100 model in the Line 6 Helix. Okay, seems simple enough on the surface, but one thing I did is I made sure I used the same impulse response on both, simply because if we are trying to compare the modeling, then changing up the modeling on the FM3 and the Helix, which are going to be different, and then changing up different IRs, we're not really showing anything. Maybe one of the IRs is preferred by one person, maybe it's a different one is preferred by somebody else. And actually in the tests, when I came up with who preferred what, it was fairly even on the number of people who preferred one over the other. So it really shows us, is there any way to say one is better or worse? Well, not really. It's just going to come down a lot of times to personal preference, and that's fine. We all have personal preference, myself included. Doesn't make me right, doesn't make me wrong. It just makes me right for my particular situation. So I had some people come out and say, well, use the same impulse response. That's cheating. Because now, the Helix stock cabs are terrible, right? This is this myth that floats around that, the Helix stock cabs are the most unusable thing. And again, I'm not giving my opinion on any of this. I'm just stating things I've read. So they said this isn't fair. And then, the typical Fractal blows the Helix out of the water, Helix blows Fractal out of the water, and all this stuff goes on back and forth. So this is one very good example of what happens so often is folks who have these strong opinions don't really understand what was being tested. We weren't testing the impulse response. If you want to go impulse response versus impulse response, then you would have to take one modeler with the same settings, play it through two different impulse responses, then listen to both, and then you're going to unleash the million different opinions, none of which are right or wrong, but of what folks prefer. And I may even prefer one to the other in one situation, and then in another situation, it's the opposite because I needed something different in the sound. So I really don't understand this passion that goes into stating that this is better, that's better, this is better, that's better. It just doesn't make sense to me. And this video, again, is not about me telling you I think modeler A or modeler B is better. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few of the ways that we must do comparisons to actually understand if our opinion can even be considered valid. Now, just a recap on my history with modelers. A lot of folks, everybody watching my channel knows I am an avid Line 6 Helix user, HX Stomp Pod Go. I love them. I love the people at the company. I love the modeling that they do. I love the feature sets of the product. I love the quality overall. It really fits my needs as a guitarist. And I use them on sessions. I use them on my own recording projects. I use them live. Although, having said that, a lot of folks think that, well, you've only ever used the Helix. In fact, for many, many years, I've been using software modeling in the studio. I've used things such as Guitar Rig. I've used IK Multimedia's Amplitube all the way from version 3 maybe, or I don't even know when, maybe before that. I've used Waves GTR plugins. I've used the built-in plugins within Cubase. I have owned and used a Kemper Profiler for 3 years. A lot of folks don't realize that. I did a number of albums and sessions with that. I played real guitar amps, obviously, for very many years and recorded real guitar amps in the studio. So I also have that experience coming from understanding how that side of things work. I owned an atomic amplifier for quite some time and used it, did some videos about it. I now have a Fractal FM3. But in full disclosure, that's my first Fractal product. I've spent quite a bit of time with it. Beautiful unit, wonderful company. And I also have my beloved Line 6 Helix. So I will never get into this discussion of which I think is better or worse. I really don't think that is even a valid thing or something that can really be proven, because again, it's going to come down to so many other things that a person is going to decide for themselves, which could be, you know, the ability to have an easy workflow and ease of use and, you know, the lack of complexity or the complexity that they want. It really, there's no way of saying one is better. I think, as I've said before, we live in a time where these all sound quite amazing. Now, having said that, if we do want to do a comparison, there's a huge number of problems that exist. Now, number one, let's talk a little bit about what we are actually doing when using a modeler. All of us have heard about this so-called amp in the room type of a thing that people seem to strive for. That's not what modelers really do, in my opinion. I mean, what a modeler is doing, used in sort of the classical way that most of us use them, is that it is modeling a specific guitar amplifier going into a specific speaker cabinet with a very specific microphone placed in a very specific place on that speaker cabinet. Now, all of those variables that I just threw out there are massively important to shaping the sound. What I just described, though, is going to be a very different experience as standing in a room with a guitar head and a guitar cabinet cranked up and hitting, you know, huge power chords or riffing away at, you know, however many decibel sound pressure level we have it set at. But yet some folks think they're going to plug a Fractal FM3 or a Line 6 Helix into their computer and listen through a little set of studio monitors and go, wow, this doesn't sound anything like my Guitar Rig. Well, of course not, because again, we aren't comparing apples to apples, we're comparing apples to oranges here. We are not comparing the experience of standing in a room with it. Now, to properly do that test, I would say that what you would need to do, and this is exactly how some folks do run their modelers, have a power amp in the room feeding a real guitar cabinet, feed out of one of our modelers with just the amp model, preferably maybe even just the preamp model if you're going into a tube power amp. See, this is where it gets very strange to even discuss because there's so many possible variables. But if we did that and had just an amp model, no speaker cabinet, no impulse response, feeding into a power amp in the room through the same speaker cabinet, now we have a much similar experience, and then we can make our proper decision as to whether we think this is very tube amp-like or not. That would be comparing apples to apples. A couple other points though, even if we were to do that test, I really believe that number one, it needs to be done blind, so that the person can switch back and forth, not knowing whether they're playing through the modeler or whether they're playing through the real tube amp head. Number two, I think that the volumes must be matched. so that we are not feeling like we prefer the louder one more. These are such important things that I can't stress enough that really make or break whether or not we can even have an opinion between the two. Now, I'm willing to bet that most folks have never done this type of test. The reason I say it has to be a blind test is because of what I talked about in a previous video, which is about confirmation bias. Confirmation bias means that when we know what we're listening to, we're going to tend to prefer one over the other for a number of different reasons. Maybe deep down inside, we want the tube amp to sound better. So therefore, if we know we're playing the tube amp, yeah, that's way better, right? We are all susceptible to this, myself included. That's why I always test myself with blind tests. Always. If I'm trying to come to a conclusion of which one I prefer, I always do the proper test. And this is the problem. So many folks seem to have very strong opinions about things, but have never gone through the motions of doing the proper tests. And sometimes the proper tests are extremely difficult or next to impossible. So when we're dealing with a modeler, such as, let's say, the fractal or the line 6 helix, obviously the Kemper is a profiler. You know, something interesting about the Kemper, I hated the Kemper until I made my own profiles. There's nothing out there that I liked. I tried a whole bunch of profiles, and I'm sure there's some great profiles out there. Maybe I just didn't try them. When I made my own profiles, then I went, oh, this is a great unit. It really represented what I wanted because I placed the microphone. I captured that snapshot of what I wanted to hear. And again, that comes down to personal opinion. Somebody else playing my Kemper profiles might have come, nah, that's not really what I want. And that's fine. It's a totally different use that they're looking for and maybe a totally different end result. And that's perfectly fine. So just to reiterate, if we are ever comparing two things and we want to come up with a valid opinion based off it, we have to do it in the right way. In a lot of cases, I even say, unless we're just trying to get the feel for what it sounds like and maybe in our pick response and whatnot, which would be something we might look for in maybe the tube amp versus modeler test I just described, we also have to use the identical performance, okay? And I've talked about this before too. When we perform a lick, we might think, oh, I played that exactly the same way as last time. But you know, we really didn't. There's no way to do that. Maybe we picked the strings a little harder. Maybe we picked a little softer in some places. Maybe we moved our pick, you know, closer to the bridge or closer to the neck. All those things, maybe we angled our pick a little bit different. All of those things will affect tone and can fool us into thinking we're hearing something that we're really not, because the difference was not in what we're trying to test. So if we do one performance and either reamp it, maybe play it into a modeler, and then feed it into whatever it is we're trying to test, that is going to be a much better way of doing things. We also then have to make sure we only have one variable involved. If we're testing out and comparing modeling, we must have the same impulse response. If we're testing an impulse response against another impulse response, or a stock cab in the helix versus something else, we have to have the exact same performance, we have to have the exact same settings on the exact same modeler feeding that. And they must be volume matched. They always have to be volume matched. These are not things I'm making up or my opinion. These are pretty well accepted facts in the audio industry. The other thing we have to take into account is a lot of folks who have these really strong opinions is that they don't take something else into account, which is something that's called echoic memory. That's the part of our memory that deals with things such as remembering timbre and tone and audio specific information. Humans' echoic memory is extremely short. I believe we store information like that for up to about 2 seconds and then it fades away very quickly. So if we listen to a sound, stop it, wait 5 seconds, and listen to the next sound, we already are having a hard time comparing. That's why a lot of examples I like to do, it's to go straight back and forth between them. And then we kind of realize, wow, maybe the differences we thought were there aren't really there as much. So it's funny, these things are so super important, yet so few people ever do them. I'm sure there's some people out there who do that for sure. And if you do it properly and you form an educated opinion rather than just sort of a wild stab in the dark opinion based off of confirmation bias, that's perfectly fine. I would never argue with somebody who says, I did the comparison perfectly, exactly with matched performance and matched volumes and only one variable, everything was perfect, and I really preferred tone B. Then there's your answer. I have no argument in that case, but it's the people who throw things out such as this. I get the, well, you know, modeler A is more realistic. It sounds more real. This is one discussion I had, which dissolved into the person I was discussing with using profanity and never answering any of the questions that I posed, which is always a sign that somebody just simply doesn't understand what they're talking about and can't really argue the points they're trying to. So, let's take that example of, this modeler sounds more real than this one. So, okay, well, how do we measure real? Well, the way a lot of these modelers work is that the people modeling the amplifier are doing it on a component-based level. They're actually modeling, as far as I understand it, the behaviors of each component in a schematic, each tube, each capacitor, each resistor, everything in a schematic they model so that they get the same kind of reaction from their model as the tube amp would be. So take something like my test with the fractal Friedman B100 versus the Helix Friedman B100, which is the placate or dirty model. Somebody brought up a very good point and said, which model did you use in the fractal? Because the fractal unit has a number of models. They're all different versions of the same head. So and that's a very valid point. Maybe I could have got them sounding closer if I had used the same model that was modeled by the folks at line 6, but I wasn't sure particularly which one it was. So that's a very good point. If we have a different version of the same amp, well, two different people modeling that amp, they both could have done a very good job, but when we compare them, it's not really apples to apples anymore, it's apples to oranges again. Possibly in the same ballpark, but there's the problem. So which one's more real? Well, really the only way to test that would be to say, take one Friedman B100 head, or whatever my amp model, I'm just throwing that out there, that was used by two different modelers modeling the exact same amp, and then do all the same settings, fed with the same performance, volume matched through the same impulse response or speaker cabinet or however you're going to monitor it, keep everything else the same, and then we could come to a very definitive conclusion about which one we think, in our opinion, again, opinion, is more real in that particular case, if that makes sense. As far as I know, that type of thing probably is not done very often. I'm sure it's been done by folks that are actually modeling these units, folks that are much smarter than I. I'm totally blown away by the folks at these companies who do what they do. I've become friends with some of them, Ben Adrian at line 6, Igor at line 6. These guys are absolutely amazing at what they do. And I'm always in awe of how they accomplish what they accomplish, and I'm just so happy they do what they do. But let me give you this too. I hear folks say, oh, I know exactly how that amp model sounds. I had that amp model for a while. What if I was to throw kind of maybe a controversial statement out there and say that I don't think any of us knows what any particular guitar amp sounds like? And here's why I say that. We always get to hear any amp we're playing through in a very particular setting, meaning that guitar amp plugged into a speaker cabinet with very specific speakers in an acoustic environment, meaning whatever room we're in, through the lens of where we are standing in relation to that guitar amp. Anybody who's ever, leaned down to put their ear sort of close to being right in the line of a guitar cabinet speaker knows that the tone dramatically changes versus if we're standing up and that same sound is blowing kind of past our pant legs. It's a massive difference. If we move around a room and really critically listen, we notice the tone actually changes depending on where we're standing. If we stand behind an amp versus in front of an amp, on axis or off axis, it's really going to change the experience. So if we're sitting in a room going, listen to my great guitar amp going through my cabinet, and I'm not even talking about miking this up, and two people are sitting in the room in different places, they're both getting different audio experiences. Maybe dramatic, maybe not. Really depends on what we're dealing with. So with that in mind, it's really hard for any of us to give an opinion on how an amp sounds. We're always hearing how it sounds through a particular lens, which is quite complex. The acoustic environment, the speaker. If you take whatever head you're playing through, change the speaker in the cabinet, change the cabinet out, well, this is going to be a different experience altogether. If we take a room and fill it full of furniture and put sound absorption up on the wall, that room's going to sound totally different. It's going to change our experience yet again. The reflected sound's going to change. It's kind of interesting to say that I don't really believe any of us has ever really heard what a guitar amp truly sounds like. Now, in the modeling world, when they actually figure out how each component in a schematic behaves, they can apparently model the behavior of that amp. But then guess what? When we hear that, it goes through all of these again. What's our monitoring system? What IR did we choose? What stock cab with what microphone? Where was the microphone placed? Okay, along those lines, here's the little experiment I want to do. I'm going to play you 5 audio files. I'm going to label them tone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm not going to tell you what this is coming from, whether it's the Helix, the Fractal, a piece of software, whatever. I'm not telling you anything about where it came from. But I just want you to listen to these sound files. Really listen to the difference between each one of them, if you hear any. And just keep in mind, the one thing is this is all from the same guitar performance. I'm going to follow my own rules here. And it's volume matched to within 0.1 dB on my loudness meters. So I would like you to listen to this and just sort of form an impression of it, and I'll be back to discuss. Okay, so what did you think? Any idea, any guesses what we were listening to there? Well, there was no modelers involved at all. That was actually my Rev G20 guitar head through my Rev 112 cabinet with a warehouse guitar speaker in it. I can't recall the model of speaker that it is. Recorded through a Sterling ST170 ribbon mic into the mic preamp on my IK Multimedia Axe IO with no processing except for one of those examples. So you might say, well, what's the difference? Did you set the settings on the amp different? Nope, didn't touch the settings on the amp at all. The settings on the amp were identical, okay? I did not move it. The only thing I did is I had one variable involved, and the variable I had involved was simply moving the microphone to different positions. I'm gonna let you hear this again with the description on the screen now of where the microphone was placed and what we were hearing. So in one of the examples, I had the microphone right up to the grill, as close as I could get it without touching it, right on the center of the cone. I had another one which was pulled 6 inches back, pointing at the center of the cone. I had another one which was right on the grill, but right to the edge of the speaker. And then I had one that was 6 inches back, pointing to the edge of the speaker. Then I took the sound that had the microphone right in the center of the cone, pretty much on the grill, and I ran it through an EQ in my DAW, and I did that for a specific reason. So listen to these again now with the description of what you're hearing. What do you guys think? Wasn't that pretty dramatic? This has nothing to do with modeling. This is a real guitar amp in a real room with a real microphone through a real mic preamp. This is as real as it gets. This has had nothing to do with modeling. So how much variation did we get simply by moving a microphone a number of inches? Maybe 3, 4 inches to the side or 6 inches back, and we have these utterly dramatic differences. And we also then can see that we can take one of them, the center of the cone right up on the grill was very tubby and kind of didn't have any bite to it. And then as soon as I EQ'd it, it could be EQ'd to sound actually usable. And I'm not saying that any of these sounds are. I just dialed the sound in really fast in the amp, through a mic, moved it around. This isn't about if I was actually using this, I would have moved that mic around until I got it sounding exactly how I wanted it. So what's my point of this? Well, the point is sometimes subtle little changes to the exact same setting where even the one little variable makes such a huge difference that we can be fooled into thinking we're hearing something completely different. So this is the argument where people say, Helix stock cabs are terrible. These impulse responses are better. And that, again, if that's somebody who's compared them in the proper way and then decided that they prefer the impulse, that's fine. I'm fine with that. My problem lies in the fact that the comparisons are not oftentimes done properly, so they can't possibly come to a proper conclusion. This is why it's so difficult to say, well, let's compare this impulse response to this Helix stock cab. How can we do that? Which speaker did was the Helix stock cab based off of? The exact speaker, in which cabinet, where was the microphone placed? I know in the Helix, for instance, we can pull it back 6 inches or back, but we heard the on and off axis sound is so much different too, so we don't have an ability to move it like that. Whereas an impulse response, we can have the maker of that impulse response mix and match microphones. Where were both of those microphones placed? I don't know. Was there a ribbon mic and a 57? Well, the exact placement of each of those is even more important now. So you see how complicated this gets. How many inches off axis were they? Were they rotated at all? Were they pulled back X number of inches? Now we have multiple microphones. Did they EQ those microphones before they captured the impulse response? That's why I threw the EQ in there. So you see where things get complicated. So somebody shooting an impulse response and adding an EQ in the chain, is that really any different than maybe, let's say, using a Helix stock cab and adding an equalizer after it? Not really. It's just that the impulse response captured that all into one little block. Okay, fair enough. And if you prefer it, that's fine. And all this is, I'm not saying, I'm making any opinions about Helix stock cabs. I use Helix stock cabs. I have no problem with them. But I think this is a good example because so many folks tend to want to talk as if they're no good and unusable. But I think this example showed that really we're not comparing apples to apples when we're comparing a Helix stock cab, or really any IR for that matter, because there's just too many variables. I could take an IR from company A and an IR from company B that both say Celestion Greenback mic'd with a Royer R121 and an SM57 mixed. Okay, really doesn't give me enough information. Those two IRs can sound dramatically different just based off of where the microphone was placed. Okay, so I guess my conclusion is, to answer the question, which modeler do I think is best? Well, let me answer that. I think the modeler that gives you the feature set you need, that allows you to get the tone that you have in your head for a particular situation, and allows you to get that the quickest, the one that you just feel best playing, I say that's the one you should go with. Who am I to sit here and tell you, you need to buy a Fractal FM3, you need to buy a Line 6 Helix, you need to buy this. I can tell you what I use. I can tell you what I enjoy, and then you can take it for what it's worth. But I just thought that was a really important discussion to have for the simple reason that I hear so many of these arguments about that sound has more depth. This sound sounds more real. This sound, and there's all these descriptive terms thrown around that really have no meaning other than to the person that is playing through it. I hear somebody say, this one feels better, that one feels better. Well, again, to figure out that feeling, we would have to have the two sound sources that we were trying to compare matched absolutely perfect sonically, and that's almost an impossibility. It's going to be very difficult because if we're saying it feels different, well, maybe if we change the settings on the modeler that we thought didn't feel as good, now we would think it feels better. Something all of these modelers seem to have, or, we can control the sag and the tube bias and all these things that do kind of affect the feel of an amp and the response of an amp, we can adjust within them. So to get all of those lined up in a way that we can actually compare the two is, in my opinion, next to impossible. So it's very hard to give that opinion unless we were able to do the comparison properly, which sometimes is next to impossible. But again, if you play one and play another, even if the settings are wrong and you think, well, this one feels better and sounds better to me, then there's your answer, right? You should do that. It's just that to nip in the bud any of the further discussions, because it really gets tiresome sometimes going online and trying to discuss this with people while typing is very time consuming. So I thought I would do a video just kind of answering where I stand on it and kind of my quote unquote final word, which whatever that means and whatever importance that has to anybody. But I thought it would be a fun video to do, and I wanted to do that little sound example for anybody who hasn't ever worked in a real studio and record a real microphone on a real guitar amp. And this is funny because a lot of folks that are new to guitar or just have been using modelers their whole life rather than going through a time where they had to record for real with real microphones and real guitar amps and real equipment in a real studio, some of this is lost on them. They don't have the understanding of how much a dramatic effect little moves of a microphone can have, for instance, right? And understanding that, I think, sometimes can help to change our views on the modeling and our opinions and be a little bit more informed about it. And it's really all it's about, is being informed. Always have educated opinions. Always have informed opinions, not just opinions that are kind of baseless. So that's my piece of advice to everybody for whatever it's worth. But in the end, everybody can do whatever they want. Anyways, guys, I hope that was a lighthearted look at this topic, which I know can be very heated at times, at the best of times between folks. So I hope that was enjoyable, and I hope it was educational for somebody out there. If not, I hope you enjoyed your time with me and listening to me blather on for a long time about this. So thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Please share this video with anybody who you think would get use out of it. Like it, please. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I will be back really soon. Thank you guys so much for sharing your time with me today, and ciao for now.